In this episode, I discuss the recently released collection J.G. Ballard Selected Nonfiction 1962 to 2007 with its editor, Mark Blacklock. I'd like to say a big thank you to all paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to keep the podcast running, as it does continue off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Mark Blacklock, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing J.G. Ballard Selected Nonfiction 1962 to 2007, which is being published by MIT Press and is being released October 24th this year, 2023. And as people will imagine from the title, this is a collection of J.G. Ballard, primarily known for novels in a way, Crash and Concrete Island, which is my personal favorite. This is a collection of his quote end quote nonfiction, which is a notion we'll get to. But just to give an example of the kind of stuff you're going to be seeing in this, things like statements or commentaries or reviews or some of the very early work when Ballard was still working as like a journalist for I think it was a chemical company. So it's a very, I would say, peculiar collection in the sense of it immediately is sort of straddling the line between what is fiction and non-fiction. But before we get to that, as sort of our primary question, I think to kick things off, Mark, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how this collection came to be.
Right. Well, hi. Thanks, James. Thanks for having me on. I have a kind of bit of a mixed portfolio. I'm a senior lecturer in modern and contemporary literature at Birkbeck, part of the University of London. But I'm fractional. I also write novels, published a couple of novels, and do bits of journalism as well. But and kind of in a way, that's sort of part of what attracted me. It was sort of with all those hats on that I got drawn towards the idea of doing this collection. As an academic, I've taught science fiction and taught cultural studies, but my writing, my kind of scholarly published work has tended to be kind of cultural, historically based. Really sort of looking at how ideas emerge and develop. And is informed by kind of philosophy and theory to the extent that that can help us to understand how those things come about. But yeah, Ballard. I first wrote about Ballard for my MA thesis at Birkbeck. I'm very lucky. My colleague Roger Luckhurst, who taught me, wrote the sort of first really serious monograph on Ballard, the Angle Between Two Walls. So I've kind of worked with Roger on Ballard stuff, and yeah, I was then doing a bit of journalism for the London Review of Books blog shortly after Ballard's death. His archive of papers was given to the British Library, and I was kind of looking through that to see what was there. Found a really interesting bit of correspondence between him and the artist Tacita Dean, and he'd sent her a catalogue essay on Robert Smithson, the land artist. It was a really fantastic piece. I loved it. Really succinct. Gives great Ballard. Really beautifully kind of phrased. And I'd not seen it before. It was kind of really obscure, and I wondered what else there might be out there that hadn't been collected. There'd been one previous collection, The User's Guide to the Millennium, which came out in 1996. And Ballard had kind of, he was at the peak of his popularity, and he edited it with David Prickett. I think it suffers a bit from being, I think it had a lot of kind of stuff that he was very much interested in at that time. It's not that well organized. And I thought there's a need for something a bit bigger that covers the full range of his career, and draws together some of these more obscure pieces that are hard to find.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember what your first... Your Ballard baptism was? What the first?
Yeah, vividly. Yeah, I was. I wasn't on. I must have been 22 because it was Cocaine Nights. I bought it in an airport on the way to a holiday in like Mallorca. So kind of a sort of Ballardian beach holiday in the Mediterranean. and I'm sure that book was sort of marketed to be a kind of holiday, an airport novel in disguise. Those sort of the late fictions that have that like kind of subverted noir done in with a kind of the mindset of a hard surrealist. That I love those, and they and so Cocaine Nights was my way in. And
were you immediately a Ballardian? Were you addicted? Did it? I mean, I think the thing with Ballard is it took me a few tries. I mean, that's why I say Concrete Island was is my personal favorite, because that was the one where I don't know, it sort of clicked, and then you can begin doing that thing that everyone does, where you go around going, "That's Ballardian." But it's sort of this like it took a while for that intuition to start. I mean, were you immediately? Did it immediately click, or did it? Yeah, were you a Ballardian from day one?
No, that's a really kind of interesting qualification, because no, I don't think I was. I mean, I then sort of stayed on track and bought them when they came out, but I didn't immediately sort of go back and look at the back catalogue. That happened when I sort of went back to studying formally in my early 30s, and so it was the Atrocity exhibition that really sealed the deal for me. And that was that kind of blew my mind, because it was not so much it was the combination of the kind of formal experimentalism with clear purpose that was then sort of deploying like elements in a collage, these kind of really extreme and transgressive ideas that he manages to get encapsulated in really tight phrases. And that, I found that really, really exciting. At the time, I was kind of, I was reading bits and bobs of science fiction, and I was sort of reading Ian Sinclair and stuff like that. That sent me down the wormhole. I then went all the way. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sure it's a tough discussion with Ballard. It really is, and this book actually made it tougher because, as you say, I'm in agreement. I didn't gel well with the previous collection, which Ballard wrote. Same opinions as yourself. It was a bit like it was a bit too focused on something that I was almost like outside of the frame of reference, and so I was like, I don't know what's really going on here. But this is very much very well put together, and as you say, it covers the entire span of his life, which is often, I think, for people sort of in a way outside of, or might just who know him, know of Empire of the Sun, and then that's sort of about it or Crash or something like that. But this really does span everything, and the reason I say it makes just this discussion more difficult is because of this question of selected non-fiction, which we were sort of joking about before we began recording. And it, as I was reading it, I was keeping that in mind of, okay, well, this is a collection which has been specifically about non-fiction, and yet all the while I'm reading it, I'm getting these elements of, well, some of this doesn't, exactly come across as non-fiction at all. I mean, to give what maybe people, if you're prudish, but the example of the review of Use Your Vagina, right, was one where it's an inherently Ballardian review of a sort of early example of a, say, revolutionary sex manual.
Yeah.
But the fact of that existence is itself so Ballardian that you enter into this frame of like, this feels like something from a Ballard novel spilling out into the pages. So what is going on with this sort of weird interzone between non-fiction and fiction?
Yeah, it's a key question, isn't it? I mean, so in the introduction, I describe it as existential, for a book like a collection of non-fiction. And that's, on the one hand, certain things are just kind of self-evidently non-fiction. A book review is non-fiction. So we can say, okay, that satisfies the category and we can pull it in. But with Ballard specifically, there's something much deeper than that, because he determinedly and again sought to kind of challenge and examine the protocols of precisely those boundaries. Again, I one of the pieces I pulled to the front of the book and call a kind of a manifesto, even though it wasn't explicitly published as a manifesto, is his introduction to the French edition of Crash. When it was published in English, it didn't have an introduction, but the French edition got an introduction, and the English original text was later published. And that, it seems to me, is a kind of really key bit for understanding his practice. And one of those, like the phrase that I kind of pull out from that, he sets out a theory. We live inside an enormous novel. For the writer in particular, it is less and less necessary for him to invent the fictional content of his novel. The fiction is already there. The writer's task is to invent the reality. So at one level, he's simply kind of inverting it, playfully. But what he's talking about are the conditions of our kind of experience of the exterior world, where you, on the same sort of plane of experience, you will have the threat of thermonuclear weapons and a shiny advert for a soft drink. And you kind of so you sort of experience the external world sort of flattens all that stuff. And so, the writer has to respond to that. If those are the conditions outside, the writer has to kind of do something different. And in his fiction, we sort of, or rather, let's not call it his fiction, but in his work, you see a number of different approaches to sort of challenging that. A couple of the examples that I give in the introduction that aren't in the book are sort of shorter pieces that I would probably think of as kind of hybrids. One of those is called The Side Effects of Orthonovin G. These are found texts, which he found from sociological journals of the late 60s. They're kind of first-hand accounts of the experience of women using a particular birth control pill. And he just puts his name at the end. He presents them as found texts and presents them as written as by J.G. Ballard. So what are we meant to do with that? Are we meant to? You're thrown immediately into questions of authorship, of propriety. What does it mean to sort of take something like that? And he's got all kinds of agendas going on. He's making a point about the liberatory effects of drugs. That point in time, he's interested in drugs broadly, but he sort of focuses on the birth control pill as socially liberatory, and so the sort of interesting stuff going on. But he's also questioning authorship. Another example that I give is the what's it called? The Secret Life of J.G. Ballard. Is another short piece, which is like a dream, a narration of a dream, but it's presented as if it were a kind of real life, a section of memoir. So he's playing with all those kind of protocols. And again, Empire of the Sun and The Kindness of Women, the two books that are sort of typically described as quasi-autobiographical, which were based on his on events in his life. When he speaks about those and writes about those, he it's clear that he's not. He's blurring the lines again. He says of Empire of the Sun, enough of it was based on fact to convince me that what had seemed a dreamlike pageant was a negotiated truth. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting phrase, right? Because that's an internal negotiation. So he's always, as Roger Lucker says in his book, he's kind of, he's exposing the hidden assumptions behind secure categorizations. And so for the nonfiction, I had to kind of acknowledge that, but then ultimately say, okay, what forms are really appropriate for a collection of nonfiction? So predominantly reviews, comments on his own work, catalogue essays, features, those kinds of things.
It's this notion of being inside a novel and of the writer having to deal with the exterior and then transform that into something that's, the fiction becomes the reality in the book, as you said. It actually reminds me of an interview that I guess would have happened around the time Trump got put in, by the satirist Chris Morris, where he was talking about, he's been fairly reluctant, I think, to actually do as much work as he was doing in the 90s with Brass Eye and The Day Today, these masterpieces of satire when, there was enough reality in media that you could satirize it. Whereas he was then saying, look, like, to paraphrase him in a way, it's like, well, what do you really expect us to do now with this reality of Donald Trump, not to be one of these people, but Donald Trump becoming president is like what, like, seriously, what, as satirists, what can you even do with this? And the question there, 1962 to 2007, do you think Ballard perhaps found more, not that he's a satirist, but do you think he maybe found to be a Ballardian more difficult by the end because the world was becoming more Ballardian? So it's like, okay, I'll just let the world do what it wants to do.
Really interesting question. He, there's no doubt his career had phases. That's one of the things that's been really nice to kind of something that one doesn't always see in I don't know if there's been an opportunity really with kind of Ballard scholarship to organise it so that you can see the different phases of his career. He sort of breaks through in new worlds as writing science fiction short stories, and they're dominated by his idea of the thing that should be interesting science fiction writers is inner space that kind of Earth is the only alien planet, we should be looking sort of inside ourselves. And then you kind of then he shifts into the sort of experimental phase around atrocity, that kind of then mutates into Crash, and then the sort of urban disaster novels, High Rise, Concrete Island. Then you have and in amongst it later, then you get the two quasi-autobiographical books. You have something slightly outlying, the Unlimited Dream Company, but kind of a purest expression of his surrealism, I think. And then the late period stuff. So this is a long-winded way to get to your question. I think in the late period work, he is doing something kind of quite specific, where he takes essentially noir plots and he sets them inside gated communities. He gives himself a sort of really kind of tight, micro communities, and he examines the effects of extreme acts of violence within those sort of environments as that are prompted almost inevitably by a sense of boredom or ennui, because that's what he sees contemporary life delivering. So did he? And also, it's interesting to line him up. I do think there's an element of sort of satire to Ballard, but he's absolutely a po-faced satirist. He picks his line and he just sticks to it and just follows the logic, and it exposes with a view to exposing, exposing unconscious urges. That's kind of a bit glib, perhaps not enough. Let's take the example of High Rise. He sets in train the notion that social order and civilization is breaking down within the confines of the building, and then says, okay, if you do away with civilization, what is going to happen? Yeah, some people are going to climb up, some people are going to fall down, and some people are going to, I don't mean to be obscene, but some people are going to have to commit incest. I was going to put that differently. But yeah, it's so he sort of follows the logic. It's so if it's a satire, it's a sort of satire on the assumption that we are, as a species, civilized and rational to any kind of degree of depth.
I think that's the beauty of Ballard, though, is there was almost just a very simplistic seed of an idea, which it has elements of sort of almost absurd satire in it. Once I was thinking of High Rise as well, but if you took Concrete Island, just this idea of what's happened if you live down there. But maybe it was that Ballard in the duration of writing realizes that you can't keep this funny for very long. Like, this doesn't stay sort of satirical in the humorous sense for very long. Eventually, this sort of, all his books are almost like pressure cookers, where you go, the opening is somewhat, there's a bit more humor in the opening, and then you go, well, actually, if we continue to stay here, this isn't going to be very nice anymore, right? High Rise being the key example, and Concrete Island maybe not turning so violent, but certainly turning sort of delirious and just strange. But it certainly brings us to two sort of interlocking questions. I mean, one is on this notion of science fiction, because the notion of science fiction seems to have not really, at least in popular appeal, broken out of big spaceships flying all over the place. Star Wars has done a lot of damage. Science fiction.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're perfectly aligned with Jim on that one.
And I mean, so that stuff has always really bored me. It's like the equivalent of reading a car manual, right? Like big spaceship flies in. Okay, I really don't care. So what was Ballard's opinion on what it is to be science fiction? And was he somewhat along that line of, well, it's so much more than that. Like the point of it is so much more.
Yeah, absolutely. He completely agreed with what you just said. I mean, literally writes a number of polemics. So when Mike Moorcock takes over editing New Worlds, where Ballard's published his first stories under Ted Carnell, Ballard's invited to kind of write a number of guest editorials, and these are basically polemics for the reform of science fiction, and they're very influential. The new wave is born at New Worlds in that period, really. And what he's saying is, H.G. Wells has had a disastrous effect on science fiction because, it's given all these ideas, all the kind of hack SF writers, the pulp writers are just redoing Wells' ideas, that you're still getting, it's all sort of extraterrestrial life forms, spaceships, galactic wars. He hates all that. What we need to do, he wants to go deeper in. He wants more he wants to think about the sciences that are contemporary to the late 60s. He wants to look at sort of deep psychology, sociology, genetic biology. What does it mean to be sort of subject to the forces of deep space and deep time as a kind of subject? And to do that, he also, because there's some. He makes a lot of kind of really important points, and he moves towards these sort of more formally non-linear stories because he feels like, sort of retrospective narrative fiction, linear narrative fiction, is not up to the job of representing the way that the present relates to the future. So there's a kind of formal implication for what he argues. But the other thing to say is that he very much really astute media operator. So for example, so he's writing these polemics in New World, but then for a sort of more general audience in Books and Bookmen in 1971, he says, science fiction is the most important fiction that has been written for the last 100 years. I believe that the reading of science fiction should be compulsory, So
who did he admire of the science fiction writers of the day?
So his kind of closest sort of pals, Brian Aldiss, he wrote an appreciation of, right, hold on, my memory is not serving me well, but he kind of liked, he likes to see science fiction in the expanded field. So he sees surrealist painters as science fiction. Judy Merrill, he's a big fan of Judy Merrill, the Canadian science fiction. I think she's American and then emigrated to Canada. And she edits a bunch of anthologies. He was close with Judy Merrill. And then, the kind of writers that cluster around New Worlds, so someone like Mike Harrison, who's still going, was young writer at New Worlds. at that point in time. But yeah, then also artists, so Eduardo Paolozzi, he's obsessed with pop art. He becomes friends with Paolozzi. He thinks Paolozzi's doing science fiction in art form.
What is surrealism for Ballard? Because it does seem to, you mentioned it there, it does seem to play a fairly big role, which I don't think, but perhaps even readers of Ballard who haven't delved into perhaps the more biographical or the non-fiction stuff wouldn't suspect to be there.
Yeah. He describes it as his first love. He first encounters it when he's a schoolboy. So after they're liberated from the internment camp in Shanghai, he's then ships back to Britain. I think he's 14 or 15 with his mother and his sister, and he's packed off to the Lee School in Cambridge. And while he's there, he discovers surrealism. There's a great photograph in the British Library archive. It's like a double exposure photograph with him in it twice, and it's clearly a sort of surrealist photograph. He's been reading up, and he's already kind of, once he starts working, he's already well aware of not just the paintings but also the poets and the essayists from the movement. So he's a close student of it. Mm-hmm. And what he finds in it are tools, techniques that he thinks are, absolutely, that are fit for purpose for dealing with these questions about the real and the false, where the fictional elements in the world are multiplying around us. If you can use the surrealism has all kinds of techniques to deal with that, not least the sort of the depiction of sort of allegorical landscapes that will sort of deal with that'll incorporate these elements from the real world and put them on the plane alongside elements of the unconscious and dream, or something like those the found texts we were talking about before, Side Effects of Orthonoving, the objet trouvé, in the surrealist tradition, or if he writes, so the series of surgical fictions he wrote, which were short pieces that take sort of instructions for how to accomplish plastic surgical procedures, and he replaces the names of the patients with the names of celebrities. Mm-hmm. So you have, Princess Margaret's facelift, and these are, they're basic, they're sort of classic détournement. He's just replacing elements in it. This is a form of surrealist practice. So it's a set of techniques. It's a kind of imaginative wellspring. I mean, in those early novels, the sort of the disaster novels, they're often called the Drowned World, the Crystal World, and so on. They, the landscapes are lifted almost literally straight out of surrealist paintings. So just a kind of wealth of imaginative stuff and technical stuff.
Mm. It's interesting. There's an interview with David Foster Wallace where he's talking about David Lynch and this notion, his understanding of surrealism. We're saying within the word surrealism is the word realism, and then sur is this extra thing. Like, you've taken realism and you've turned it up. I mean, and that, whether or not one agrees with that definition of surrealism, I know some surrealists who probably wouldn't. It does seem to me that, like, going back to what we were talking about with the gated communities, this notion of it starts out completely real. You're in a skyscraper, you're in a high rise with a load of people from different whatever backgrounds, and it's like, okay, let's just leave that. And then if you leave that be, it becomes surreal. So something else is the reality is really doing the work for Ballard. I guess the question is eventually, like, what happens when you can't separate the two, and the surrealist part folds back into the realist, and you're left with sort of quite a damaged world. But
interesting. I think that's right. The elements of the real world, you create the kind of the framework that has some purchase in the real world and incorporates the real world. But I think the key thing is it sort of either proceeds by a logic that is dreamlike, mm-hmm. or that it treats on the same level elements of kind of dreamlike or unconscious thoughts and desires as treats those on exactly the same level as things that are kind of empirical objects from the real world. And those two things, I think, really work to. It can feel really sort of cathartic and liberating, right? Kind of to sort of disturb the rational order in that way, I think.
Well, I think, yeah, it's certainly a disturbance, but then I guess perhaps the real disturbing thing is eventually you sort of, I don't know, at least for myself, it's almost you can't differentiate between. Yeah, by the end you're just as stuck as they are. I mean, this is why I asked at the beginning when you first started reading Ballard about whether or not it sort of sunk in, because I remember when I first read him, it was Crash, and I was probably in a way like too young and too out of. I mean, I wasn't super young, but I was too out of the loop in a way to like fully get it. And I think the problem was, thinking back, was like I was venturing in with this mindset of like trying to follow a specific thing. So usually it's like I'll try follow the characters. That's probably what you're doing by default, is seeing where the characters go. But it's why I had a question about, really in Ballard's worlds, or the world of Ballard, if you like, something else is really in charge, if you want to put it in that way. And like human beings are just that. They're like Earth, as once again, as you said, Earth is the only alien planet. Human beings become these just strange vessels for whatever. And in Crash, it's really like a vessel for some strange Freudian libidinal mechanic thing firing out. And then you realize I can't really follow the people because the main character, quote unquote, if you like, is something else that I can't quite grasp. So what's in charge? I mean, what is it that's pulling these Ballard stories along?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got the libido, the unconscious, absolutely is driving the narrative. I mean, I have to say, I look back at Crash when I was doing this book, because there was a great edition, a collector's edition, edited by Chris Beckett, who's the archivist at the British Library, and it's got lots of kind of lovely epitaphs and stuff. But I started reading it again, having read it about 10 years previously, and what really struck me this time around was the absolute kind of the quiddity of the language, like that just the sort of the real to say things are surgically precise with Ballard has become a bit of a truism, right? Like that his phrasing is surgically precise, but it really, really is in Crash. It's literally the language is taken from. We know he was reading surgical manuals, and so I think the language in Crash is doing some extra work. It's so. I mean, again, visceral would be. It's sort of almost redundant to say it's visceral, because he describes body parts, anatomical sort of descriptions of the fusions of bodies and machines with such precise, detailed language that it's just sort of massively impressive, in a way, with all the what's behind the language. So it works. It does that. It works. It can focus your attention on the language at the surface because it's so impressive. The kind of morality and the meaning just is irrelevant to it. So it operates like a machine, I think. And yeah, that's what really struck me reading it again, how impressively that works. So there's a machinery, I think, as well, a machinery that sort of works to it's remarkable. It's the fruit of some really determined experimentation for about 5 years, I think, that gets in there. But it's about this being able to fuse at the level of language the precise kind of amounts of technical and bodily kind of corporal terminology to produce this sort of this sheen, this highly polished machine that delivers something so weird.
I mean, you mentioned morality there. I mean, do you think there is morality of this Ballard?
I think so. The classic reading, Baudrillard read Crash as amoral. He said there was simply, it just didn't work to a logic of morality. But that caused a stir when Baudrillard's essay was translated into English and published in Science Fiction Studies. And I've got Ballard's response to that in the collection, but not the other responses. It was edited by Istvan Cicero-Rone Jr. at the time, and various kind of scholars of science fiction and technology responded. And some were really outraged by the idea that you could read it as just amoral, just like not, because they were saying you can't divorce the fact that women's bodies and bodies are being violently intersected in this book. You can't just kind of but of course the point is about representation, isn't it? I mean, it's about the language is representing these things, and that there is always, this is what I mean about it being a sort of machinery of language. I don't think that it is, of course, a representation. And can the representation itself have an inherent morality?
It's one of those big questions that no one really wants.
I don't think I'm fit to go there myself.
So, I mean, just to jump back to this, I mentioned about other things being something else pulling everyone along, the unconscious drives within these books. What is happening to the individual? Because the nonfiction gives us, just to try to get it back to the nonfiction. The nonfiction does emphasize this fact that we're sort of lost. To draw someone else who I guess probably gets written about alongside Ballard fairly often, though I don't know that for sure. There's a sort of McLuhan aspect to this book, in the sense of actually something I was reading just from it last night about Ballard saying that he loved working in, was it Chemistry and Industry, the magazine or something?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
He said he loved working there because he was basically in the center of a data flow.
Yeah.
Just being, I mean, and then this is the 60s, so it's maybe the real beginnings of that notion of like the McLuhan notion of just being absolutely overwhelmed by sort of indiscernible data. And this does come through in the nonfiction, this relationship to, reviews, as you said earlier on, reviews and statements. Ballard is transforming them into something else, and in a way, allowing us a look into how we approach data. But in that sense, the individual, the ego, the human being is sort of changed. We don't really have the relationship we thought we did with adverts, with whatever it might be, with books, with TV. So what's happening to the individual?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. He loves that kind of the. Okay, so I mean, what he says that what he diagnoses as the result for the human subject immersed in that kind of overwhelming mediascape, he calls the death of affect. So, essentially a kind of a muting, a complete sort of switching off of emotional response. That the only, he sees that the individuals are kind of just not sort of responding emotionally as they should be to mediated events. Mm-hmm. For example, something terrible happens on telly, you can't feel it. Mm-hmm. I think hence his particularly in the sort of atrocity exhibition period, his strong interest and attraction to the Kennedy assassination and the way in which that was mediated, but also to atomic bomb tests and the blasts at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the sort of imagery of that, the ways in which sort of socially traumatic events on a global scale are sort of flattened and deadened within media, certainly at least at the point at which they're received by the individual subject. So there's that. I mean, he also, I think it's clear that his experience in Shanghai and the Lunghua internment camp, and then seeing it under the conditions of the Japanese occupation, and sort of witnessing as a young teenager acts of really kind of unbelievable cruelty and violence committed during a war, sort of kind of like recalibrates his sort of views on how what the human is. So he's always, I think, this idea that civilization is just a veneer, that we're basically just animals capable of incredible cruelty and violence, is is the way that he sort of sees the human as a species, but then also immersed in later in a mediascape. And I think that's why Freud kind of makes so much sense to him when he encounters Freud. It's sort of here's a kind of body of thought that will begin to help you understand how the irrational processes can still sort of govern our behavior. So yeah, I mean, I've got some great. I mean, he says human beings. This is from a review. Human beings seem to need something to fear, and catastrophic climate change taps into our deepest fantasies of world destruction. So he's always thinking about fantasies, desires, the things that sort of as the forces that drive human behavior.
I mean, this sort of goes back to the question earlier about whether or not he found it more difficult or how his writing changed over time. But do you think that he saw, or there is a progression to that derealization, that depersonalization, that apathy, that realization of the animal self? I mean, technologically, it seems, the gated community has almost been reduced to the gated community of one, right? A remote worker, living on their own, doing everything from home is the ultimate gated community. But is there almost like an acceleration or a progress of that Ballardianism, that complete, the veneer of civilization just being swept into this tumult of surrealism and violence, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, he's very, the way he kind of presents the, what he thinks is the sort of future of the human is very ambivalent. I think it's fair to say. He sort of talks about like welcoming, perversions and pathologies, and as these will liberate us from the boredom of the future. But as always with Ballard, I don't think we can just take him at face value. He's a provocateur. Does he really want the world to be like that? He certainly wants us to think about that. No doubt. But I don't think I don't think what he's prescribing is a kind of Desardian descent into kind of. But he does he does he talks about a kind of benevolent and morally free psychopathology. And as I say, I kind of tend to take that with, I think he certainly thinks that we should we should indulge our fantasies, for sure.
Are they our fantasies though?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. Are they just? To what degree are they the at some point, in this kind of subjective experience, the unconscious urges fuse with the exterior mediascape, right? And that's
yeah. But I mean, that was another question. This question of the future. So, but you think Ballard was, in this in-between space that we've been discussing, Ballard is actually quite reluctant to sort of say this is what the future is going to be like?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because he has the reputation of being incredibly prescient. He's the seer of Shepperton, and but I tend to think that he was really just an incredibly astute analyst of the contemporary, and was always looking forwards rather than backwards. So that might seem like quite a sort of slight qualification, but really what he's doing is analysing what's happened now. So to kind of go back to your Trump question earlier on, he was obsessed with Ronald Reagan because he was a screen actor who then kind of used that massive popularity to become governor of California and then the president of the United States. And he was on to Reagan early. He was really interested in him when he became governor of California, because this was sort of, and Reagan was a right populist, and Ballard sort of saw the potential for, kind of national, international level, wickedness in someone who was simply using their kind of media image to get themselves where they wanted. So he's interested in celebrity as well, and how that could be used, and how people kind of projected desires onto celebrities. And so I think, there's no doubt Trump would have, in some ways, Trump is the sort of the rerun of that kind of Reagan formulation on steroids, and the natural progression. And that, to me, that indicates how astute Ballard's analysis of his moment was. He saw a particular forces conjoining in Reagan, and those are the same forces that kind of produced Trump. So.
What is it to be Ballardian?
Okay. Follow your obsessions. And I think that's the best one. Follow your obsessions. Because I think that's what probably what Simon Sellers has done. To do to applied Ballardianism is all about following your obsessions. That's the bit that I think found the most useful bit of advice from reading Ballard. It's also, I think, probably to be Ballardian. I mean, most Ballardians are obsessive, right? And they do. I mean, but it's a really kind of good community. I have to say that everyone I reached out to help sort of find pieces was incredibly generous with their time and their knowledge. So the community of Ballardians is a community worth knowing and being part of. But I think obsessive, definitely. Probably interested in those formulations. Sex times technology is the future. There's got to be an interest in those kinds of ideas. In what the future might hold, and the kind of cultural analyses that look at the contemporary sort of in a really unflinching way. It's a good question. I haven't given that a lot of thought. Certainly, my own version of it is definitely just to be really obsessive and hunt things out.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just to bring it back to the book and this obsession, because it is a collection of a lot of things you might not have read about of Ballard, or seen about him, or known about him. So what do you think this selected nonfiction 1962 to 2007 shows or reveals about Ballard that someone who maybe just read the usual collection of novels or fiction, what do you think it reveals or shows that might be surprising?
Yeah. So there's if they've just read the novels, there are probably a couple of things. I mean, the memoirs and tributes I put at the end, because they have that kind of, they're more personal, and they show what a sort of generous friend he was, I think. And it's nice to finish on that note. And if you read Miracles of Life, his autobiography, which is exceedingly brief and modest, that you'll get a kind of flavour of that. But what the other thing I mentioned briefly before is being able to sort of line up the different phases of his career. Genre reformist. Someone who said, right, this entire genre of fiction isn't working for me. It needs to work like this, and did it. And then as a successful genre writer, reviewing for national newspapers, then starts writing these, because he believes that the formal kind of organization of contemporary fiction isn't working, starts writing these really formally experimental books, and they're incredibly successful as experiments, and then becomes a mainstream, garlanded mainstream author whose sort of novel is filmed by Steven Spielberg. So there's that, being able to see the career in the round. And the other side probably is just like how good his kind of how good he was at writing almost sound bites. Those punchy little. The ad man is never far from the surface. We've touched on a couple of them here. Earth is the only alien planet. Sex times technology is the future. He was really great at coining these lines and then using them again and again. He knew how to work it. So that is I suppose the final thing would be he was an expert manager of his own image. And I think that's something that we begin to see in the non-fiction.
It's a fantasy question, and I think it's quite tough. I mean, we drew in Donald Trump earlier as this sort of almost cyclic repetition of Reagan, turned up to 11. But what do you think Ballard might be honing in on if he was still around today? What's the Ballardian moment of our day?
I mean, so there was quite a lot of commentary during the sort of enforced self-isolation of COVID that highlighted the ways in which he'd sort of predicted certain of these. Certainly, his fiction seemed to anticipate certain conditions under which we were living. I think you also, you've mentioned how we all become kind of isolated in our own little, individual gated communities. That's a sort of very Ballard thing. Would he go kind of even, given that he'd already occupied that territory, how much deeper could he go into that? I mean, I think he'd be fascinated with the royal family. For sure. I mean, he already was, but the way that the royal family's operating, I think that would attract him. He loved television, and there isn't a lot on TV in this collection because he didn't write on it a lot, but he did recommend watching 5 hours a day. And I think he could have got really into certain sort of the more extreme forms of reality TV. I think he would have enjoyed that.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
and then everyone would have asked him to tell us about right populists, and rightly so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where would you advise people to begin with Ballard?
Good question. Probably. You want one of the ones that's going to be that sort of gives you the content, not too challenging first up. So don't dive in on Crash or the Atrocity Exhibition. I would probably recommend starting with. I mean, High Rise is not a bad place to start, is it? Because it's got a lot of the elements and of the sort of emergent idea of the enclosed community. It's got the sort of pursuit of psychopathologies within that environment. It's got that logic pursued with a real kind of gimlet eye towards the end. So that's a good place to start. Vermilion Sands as a collection is really good for the science fiction because that has his sort of really lovely expression of his idea of the future just dominated by kind of leisure and therefore quite boring, but with real imaginative heft. I mean, the short stories, the collected short stories be fantastic. So yeah, there you go. High Rise, collected short stories. And then if you like that, then just go in at the deep end and get the annotated edition of the Atrocity Exhibition with all the commentary.
Is there anything you'd like to add about the selected nonfiction that we haven't touched on or you feel is key about the book?
We've covered a lot of ground, James. I mean, I think, I wanted to sort of organize it in a way so that it was kind of easy to dip into and dip out of, so that it was accessible. I hope that I mean, it's got. We've got I don't know if the version you've got has the full index. So I've got a really lovely index, which is itself a work of art. So, it enables people to kind of really get a glimpse of the kind of key ideas just by scanning through that. So, I mean, that's really what I'd say. I think it's been, fortunately, it's available at a kind of accessible price, and it's a book that I wanted, and now I'm doing an advert. I realise.
No, it's completely fine. It's sort of everything becomes an advert eventually, I think.
So yeah, but that's it. I mean, hopefully it's something that you can have on your bedside and just dip into and dip out of. And part of the reason for wanting to do it is I thought, which writer would I like to spend? I'm going to need to spend a number of years doing this. Who do I want to spend that time with? And it was Ballard.
I think it says a lot about someone, right? Because when you see books about certain thinkers, you have to think, man, that person spent. Because when you write a book about someone else, it very much is like they become your, I don't know, some artificial surrogate friend, and you start to see their personality, and sometimes you start to resent them, I guess.
That's absolutely right. Well, I've come out with nothing but admiration and respect. It's been a real privilege to the estate let me work on it, and that's been great. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it seems to be a good place to finish up. But J.G. Ballard, Selected Nonfiction, 1962 to 2007, will be released October 24th. So I'll put the links in the description below. And a big thank you to MIT Press for sending me the free copy. Big thank you to you, Mark Blacklock, the editor, for appearing. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James.